In today's video, we're going to be looking at the Berlin Wall crisis of 1961. There are 4 essential questions that you need to be able to answer by the end of this video. The first, why were many East Germans escaping to the West via West Berlin? The second, Khrushchev issues ultimatums twice during this crisis. When does he do this? What are the ultimatums asking for? And what was John F. Kennedy's reaction to the last ultimatum? The third question, why did Khrushchev order the construction of the Berlin Wall? And the fourth, what were the consequences of the building of the Berlin Wall? So let's first look at a bit of a review of the situation in Berlin. Berlin was divided into 4 sectors: French, British, American, and Russian. It was deep within Soviet territory, and therefore West Berlin was sort of cut off from the West. And the East German government was very unpopular and led by a man named Walter Ulbricht. So what was life like in Berlin at this time? Well, the living standards in East Germany were falling behind the West, and this was particularly evident in East Berlin, where the living standards were tolerable. But in West Berlin, shops were full of goods, people had a lot of freedom, and there was a great wealth and variety. This was done deliberately by the Western powers as a sort of showcase to show how great capitalism was. Until the 1950s, East Germans could freely go to visit West Berlin and see all of the goods on offer. Once in West Berlin, the East Germans could go on to West Germany. So what was the result of the situation? East Germans wanted to go to the West because of how great it seemed, how much wealthier and happier the West seemed than the East. And between 1949 and 1961, 2.7 million East German refugees used this route to get to the West. Mostly, the people who were leaving East Germany were highly skilled workers or well-qualified managers, and the communist government could not afford to lose these kinds of people. And from Khrushchev's point of view, it looked really bad that people were kind of running away from communism. So this was a huge problem for the Soviets as a whole and for East Germany as a country. What ended up happening was Khrushchev's ultimatums. He got a bit fed up with the situation, and on November 10th, 1958, he gave his first ultimatum, in which he declared that Berlin officially belonged to East Germany, and he demanded the US, British, and French forces to withdraw within 6 months. Khrushchev declared that Berlin officially belonged to East Germany, and he demanded the US, British, and French to withdraw their troops within 6 months. President Eisenhower at the time was unsure of how to respond. He didn't want to lose West Berlin, but he also didn't want to start another war. And so they agreed to hold an international meeting to discuss the issue in the summer of 1959. I should mention that this first ultimatum sparked a 3-year crisis that basically, as you will see, culminated in the building of the Berlin Wall. So let's move on to 1959, which was a year of international meetings. Meeting number 1 took place on May 11, 1959. It was called the Geneva Foreign Ministers' Conference. And guess what? It takes place in Geneva. They made progress towards mutual understanding, but again, they weren't really coming to any real conclusions, and they agreed to meet again. The second meeting occurred September 25th to 26th in 1959 at Camp David, which is the presidential retreat. And again, they made progress, but still no conclusion was agreed to. 1960, as we learned in our last video, was the year of the U-2 incident. The Paris conference was a complete flop, and talks ceased between Khrushchev and Eisenhower. And basically, Khrushchev was just waiting for the newly elected John F. Kennedy to take power. From June 3rd to 6th in 1961, John F. Kennedy and Khrushchev met for the first time at the Vienna Summit Conference. These were the first negotiations between the two of them. They talked about many things, including nuclear disarmament and Berlin. However, again, the final outcome was that there was no agreement on the Berlin issue. So, after this, Khrushchev kind of had a little bit of a freak out yet again, and he gave his second ultimatum, which really occurred over 2 speeches on August 7th and 11th. And yet again, he gave the Western powers 6 months to get out of Berlin. Khrushchev thought that Kennedy, since he was young and inexperienced, was going to be easy to push over. But he judged Kennedy completely wrong. Kennedy responded by activating 150,000 reservists. These are people who have been trained for the army and are basically part-time soldiers. They have another job when they're not needed. He also committed to spending an additional $3.2 billion on defense. And perhaps more frightening, he allocated $207 million for building nuclear fallout shelters. So Kennedy basically responded to Khrushchev's ultimatums by preparing the US for war. Khrushchev didn't want to start a war because he knew that the USSR couldn't win, as the USA had 20 times more nuclear weapons at this point than the USSR did. So his problem was what to do. He didn't want to look weak, and he couldn't force the Americans to leave. So on the night of August 12, 1961, East German troops secretly built a barbed wire fence around the entire West Berlin to prevent the free movement of people between East and West Berlin. And within 5 days, the fence was being reinforced, and eventually it would become a heavily guarded wall. All crosspoints were sealed, except for one crosspoint known as Checkpoint Charlie. And the border guards who were guarding the fence were ordered to shoot people trying to defect to the west. The USA immediately condemned the wall because it divided families and limited freedom. The US also regularly sent diplomats and troops across the wall into East Berlin to see how the Soviets would react. Then, a few months later, on October 27th, Soviet tanks pulled up to Checkpoint Charlie and refused diplomats access to the east. The US responded by getting their tanks, and there was a fully armed and very tense standoff between the two, which you can see in this photo. About 18 hours later, one by one, 5 meters at a time, the tanks slowly pulled back, and Khrushchev told the Prime Minister of East Germany not to do anything to increase the tension further. Kennedy was noted as saying that the wall is not a very nice solution, but a wall is a hell of a lot better than a war. So what were the consequences of this, the building of the wall? The first was that it ends the USSR's refugee crisis, which was a positive for the USSR and East Germany. The second was that it was a propaganda victory for the West because it made it seem like the communist states had to build walls to keep their people from escaping. And third, the wall became a symbol, a very potent symbol, of division, and it is the most iconic image of the Cold War in Europe. In 1963, Kennedy visited Berlin and declared that Berlin was a symbol of the struggle between the freedom of the West and the communist world. And that is the Berlin Crisis of 1961. Thanks for watching.